presenters this evening, two of whom are here and one of whom is in a cab. Oh, is that right?
Two
we have two
total.
presenters,
One,
sorry.
50%.
Half of our presenters are here. And rather than trying to entertain you with bad jokes, I will simply remind you that the makeup class for the non-snow event is scheduled for the end of the month, that is to say Wednesday the 25th of April. And on that note, I want to thank the law school folks who did the scheduling of tonight's event. The subject matter seems very much in tune with the activities going on around the country commemorating the 50th anniversary of the assassination just at a moment around now, as a matter of fact, of Martin Luther King. So we are very much in tune with the times. And with that note, I will turn the microphone over to Dan Urman.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming this evening and braving the rain. We're going to have two speakers tonight. The first is Chiraag Bains, who's seated down in front of us. So I'm going to introduce the speakers and their biographies, and then, as usual, we will play these clips. So Chiraag Bains is the legal director at Demos, which is a think and do tank based in Washington, D.C. He's also a visiting senior fellow at the Harvard Law School Criminal Justice Program. He has served as a federal prosecutor and senior official in the United States Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, and is a leadership in government fellow at the Open Society Foundation. Mr. Bains worked at the Department of Justice during much of the Obama administration. In particular relevance to today, he was a member of the team that investigated the Ferguson, Missouri Police Department for a pattern or practice of unconstitutional conduct, and co-wrote the Ferguson Report, which many of you may be familiar with. He also helped oversee the work of housing and civil enforcement, criminal, special litigation, and appellate sections. He clerked for Judge Karen Nelson Moore on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, and for Judge Nancy Gertner right here in the Federal District Court in Boston. Chiraag earned his JD from Harvard Law School, where he was an editor on the Harvard Law Review, and a Paul and Daisy Soros Fellow. He earned an MPhil in criminology from the University of Cambridge on a Gates Scholarship, as a Truman Scholar, and was a Coro Fellow as well, and earned his bachelor's degree from Yale College. And thanks for joining us, Chiraag. Also, on her way, fighting through Boston traffic, is Pat Williams, who is the James Dohr Professor of Law at Columbia Law School. She's taught at the University of Wisconsin, City University of New York, and Golden Gate University School of Law. She was a deputy city attorney for the Office of Los Angeles City Attorney, a staff lawyer for Western Center on Law and Poverty, and has published widely in the areas of race, gender, and law. Her books include The Alchemy of Race and Rights, The Rooster's Egg, and Seeing a Colorblind Future, The Paradox of Race. She's also a columnist for The Nation. She was a MacArthur Fellow, served on the Board of Trustees at Wellesley College, and earned her bachelor's from Wellesley and her Juris Doctorate from Harvard Law School. So we're going to begin with these clips, and then we'll hear from our speakers.
Good. All right, hello everybody. Hello. Nice to see you. I'm Chiraag Bains, as Dan said. I worked at DOJ for a while. I'm now with an organization called Demos. Demos is a public policy organization that is working very hard for an America where everyone has an equal say in our democracy and an equal chance in our economy. So we work on democratic issues, voting rights, democratic participation, and also economic justice issues. Criminal justice, of course, intersects with both of these worlds quite dramatically. And I'm the legal director there. So we bring lawsuits, we also do legal advocacy, and I'll just say we're hiring. So if anyone's interested in joining the legal team or has a research background or a communications background, think about Demos, come talk to me afterward. And I'm hoping to do some work on criminal justice while I'm at Demos, but I'm going to talk today about work that I did while at the Justice Department on police accountability. So we've just seen these videos which are deeply disturbing and focus on these high-profile incidents, these high-profile police shootings and other excessive uses of force. And these are in many cases contested, whether it was excessive, right? You've got people on both sides of these issues, and it can be quite heated. And I think these videos show you how police violence and the lack of justice in these individual cases can alienate the community from law enforcement and from government overall. It has given rise to uprisings, sometimes violent in nature, in communities across the country for years. Right? We started the video with Rodney King. We could have gone further back to Watts. So Watts, Rodney King. In our modern day, we've seen it in Ferguson. We saw it in Baltimore after Freddie Gray. After Freddie Gray passed away, about a week after he was injured in a police van during a transport. And I think when you step back and you think about the sources of frustration here, there are several. I mean, the incidents seem to keep happening. Right? We know now because of the data collection of newspapers, and I would also say of an independent group called Mapping Police Violence, which comes out of Campaign Zero, that there are some 1,100 to 1,200 people who are killed by police every year. And about 900 to 1,000 of those are the result of fatal police shootings. And the people who are killed by police are disproportionately people of color, in particular in the group of people who are unarmed at the time that they are killed by police. Another source of frustration is the failure of the Supreme Court to adequately regulate police behavior, both in terms of use of force and also in terms of conduct that gives rise to racial profiling. Another is the apparent ingrained bias toward police officers of decision makers all along the spectrum in our justice system. We see it with prosecutors and their reluctance to bring charges. And having been a prosecutor at DOJ, I have some sense of where that comes from. There's a deep sense of connection to law enforcement, to those who are on the front line and relying on them on a day-to-day basis. Also makes it more difficult to bring charges against them. We see it in judges. I used to work in the unit of the Civil Rights Division that brought criminal cases against police officers for excessive force. And judges were not fond of those cases in particular parts of the country, and it wasn't just limited to, say, the South. I saw that in different parts of the country. And juries. We've seen many cases where even when charges are brought, juries are reluctant to disbelieve, second guess, a police officer. They're reluctant to convict, and again, going back to judges, even where there are convictions, we don't see jail time very often. And not that jail time is the only metric of justice, but it is the one that we use for other people who are accused of crimes. And we don't see similar sorts of punishments in these police cases. So I wanted to speak a little bit about the video and about these police cases, these individual incidents, but I also want to step back and caution against focusing too much on these high-profile incidents, because it's not just these high-profile incidents that results in the lack of trust between communities and their police departments. It is also the daily mistreatment and the daily indignities that are suffered by people in communities, particularly poor people and people of color, at the hands of law enforcement, that corrodes the faith of communities in their own government. And to illustrate that, I want to talk about a particular case that I was involved in that Dan mentioned, the investigation of the Ferguson Police Department that began in 2014. So we know that in August 9th of 2014, Michael Brown was shot and killed by Darren Wilson, an officer of the Ferguson Police Department. We saw massive protests. We've got a few pictures here of people confronting the police, of the highly militarized police response, which was led by the St. Louis County Police Department that was managing most of this at the time. And there was real intense focus on this. This became a national issue, as I'm sure most people in this room remember. Ferguson is a small town of 21,000, suburban Missouri, not really on most people's radar, certainly not on the Justice Department's radar, until this event happened. And there was just an eruption and an outpouring of anger from the community and from people who were living in that community. Yes, people came from other places as well, but there's this false narrative that developed that they're just outsiders. I spent a lot of time in this community, and I can tell you that people who were there night in and night out were people who lived in and around Ferguson. And so then there's quite a bit of journalism that was done about problems in Ferguson, sort of zooming out from the Michael Brown incident, and it became, there were some signals there that maybe there was a deeper problem here, and it wasn't just a situation where there was one incident, one shooting that led to this, this uprising. And what we ended up doing is opening an investigation of the Ferguson Police Department overall. So 2 different investigations. August 9th, Mike Brown was killed. August 10th, DOJ had criminal investigators and a prosecutor from the main DOJ office, along with the FBI, on the ground conducting an investigation. September 4th, some 3 to 4 weeks later, we opened a civil investigation of the whole police department. And those civil investigations are called pattern or practice investigations. They proceed under a statute that passed in the wake of the uprising or riots that followed the acquittal in the Rodney King case. So Rodney King, you saw the footage there. At the state level, the officers were acquitted. There was a subsequent federal prosecution by the office that I worked in, where 2 of the 4 officers were convicted. And there had been some movement before that to try to create a statute that would empower DOJ to investigate police departments. And it was really this response to the Rodney King, post-Rodney King incident violence and criticism and the community communications that were going on there in the community about long-standing problems that helped lead to this being included in the 1994 crime bill. So the 1994 crime bill was by and large quite bad from my perspective when it comes to criminal justice issues. Massive expansion of the death penalty, billions of dollars for prison funding, and we saw an explosion of prisons, increasing use of mandatory minimums, but it did include within it, buried this provision that allowed the Justice Department to investigate police departments overall, not just individual officers, but whole police departments and the jurisdictions, the juridical entities under which they fell, so the county or the city, for what's called a pattern or practice of unlawful conduct, which is generally violations of the Constitution, but there are some other legal provisions that apply as well. So we did these 2 investigations, and on 6 months after the second investigation started, on March 4th, 2015, Eric Holder, then the Attorney General, released the 2 reports. In one report, focusing on the criminal investigation, we found that and I should say these were 2 separate teams that were doing these 2 investigations. So the criminal team found that there was not probable cause to believe that a crime had been committed, that is, that a federal crime had been committed, that is, that Darren Wilson violated Mike Brown's rights and did so in a way that violated federal law when he shot and killed him. No probable cause. And that report analyzed the forensics, did in-depth interviews with all witnesses. There were canvasses that covered hundreds of people. There was grand jury work done at the state level. And so this report also discussed witnesses who may have appeared before the grand jury there and talked about witnesses changing their stories or explaining what their initial statements were and what they really saw. There were witnesses who initially said things, they saw things, and then ultimately when confronted about it admitted that they hadn't seen certain things. And the report essentially established that Mike Brown was not surrendering at the time that the shooting happened. That is, he wasn't putting his hands up in surrender. At least the evidence didn't support that narrative. And yet that is the narrative that we all saw play out on TV, right? And we're all familiar with the hands up, don't shoot narrative, which is actually, I would say, quite applicable in a number of other situations, but didn't seem to apply here based on what the evidence found. So how is it that that is the narrative that persisted and that drove and that this incident drove thousands and thousands of people into the streets? The answer, I think, lies in the findings of the other report. So the other report found that there was a pattern or practice of misconduct on several levels within the Ferguson Police Department as a whole. And on this next slide, you can see them. I'll just very briefly tell you: unlawful stops without reasonable suspicion or arrest without probable cause in violation of the Fourth Amendment, excessive force, again under the Fourth Amendment, interference with First Amendment rights. So this was suppressing protests, also retaliating against people who criticized the police or spoke back to them on the street on daily encounters. And discrimination, both intentional discrimination and disparate impact. So violations of the Equal Protection Clause under the 14th Amendment and of Title VI, a federal statute that prohibits unjustified disparate impact for entities that receive federal funding. And due process violations and equal protection violations in the way that the local court was running. We found that there was a pattern or practice of all of these kinds of misconduct, all of these kinds of violations. And so I think that helps explain why it is that people took to the streets. It wasn't just this one incident. There was a long-standing pattern of conduct here that explains how you ended up getting what we see in this picture. That is, a community that was confronting law enforcement and saying, hey, we, the community, particularly the black community here in Ferguson, feel under siege by those who are sworn to protect us. Now, at the root of this distrust and the pattern of unlawful conduct, or the patterns of unlawful conduct that we found, lay a policy decision made by Ferguson's civilian leaders, not its line officers. The policy decision was the decision to use its municipal court as a revenue generation center and its police department as a collections agency in order to generate funds for the community. For years, residents in the area had been saying this. This was new to us as DOJ because we came to Ferguson to do these two investigations, but it wasn't new to folks who lived there, and it shouldn't have been new to any government officials because people had been talking about this and complaining that the poor were targeted for ticketing and for arrest to fund city operations for generations. The DOJ investigation was helpful because it uncovered hard proof of this. And I'm going to show you a couple examples here. So in this next slide you will see an email that we uncovered here. This is from the finance director to the city manager. Let me just say the way this works is Ferguson has a city council of 7 people. 6 of them are city council members, one's the mayor, and the city council hires a city manager. The city manager then hires all the department heads, including the finance director on the one hand and the police chief on the other. So this is the finance director telling the city manager, hey, court fees are anticipated to go up 5%, 7.5%. I asked the chief if he thought the police department could deliver 10%, and he said that they could try. Next slide. Here's the finance director again. The finance director figured quite prominently into discussions of police operations, which is not typical, or at least shouldn't be. Here he said, unless ticketing ramps up significantly before the end of the year, it'll be hard to significantly raise collections next year. What are your thoughts? Given that we are looking at a substantial sales tax shortfall, it's not an insignificant issue. And the chief writes back, and you can see it here, I'm looking at different shift schedules, which will put more officers on the street. And in turn, it goes on to say you can target the $1.5 million forecast. And be pleasantly surprised if we exceed that mark. I mean, where was this money coming from? This money was coming from the most strapped citizens in the community, and primarily people of color, which in Ferguson means black people. This was a very black and white town. Next slide here, you can see again the finance director is emailing the city manager, copying the police chief this time, talking about a particular enforcement program that he wants to run. He says there's nothing to keep us from running this initiative, which was a traffic enforcement initiative, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or even 7 days a week. Admittedly, he notes that 7 days a week we would see diminishing returns, and then he has some further thoughts, and he says this would begin to fill the revenue pipeline. This is what's known as a smoking gun in the legal world. So these are some examples of people who shouldn't have a hand in what police enforcement strategy looks like at all, directing it on a day-to-day basis in a very clear way. And the supervisors in the police department got the message, and they structured patrol assignments accordingly to maximize ticketing rather than to ensure public safety. which again, there were a number of needs other than traffic enforcement in the community in Ferguson. Taking a look at this next slide here, here is an example of that. The captain is saying to the lieutenants and copying the chief, for those officers who are not keeping up an acceptable level of productivity means ticketing, and they have already been addressed at least once, if not multiple times, take it to the next level. Here he is encouraging discipline for those officers who don't meet what were essentially quotas. And he says here that the officers can be taken out of a cover car position, assign them to the prisoner pickup, and bank runs. Those are undesirable jobs for officers. Failure to perform can result in disciplinary action, not just a bad evaluation. Several officers told us on the DOJ team that they opposed this relentless focus on ticketing and on revenue generation. A lot of these people entered the profession in order to serve their community, not to saddle them with debt that they could never pay back. I remember one officer said to me directly, you know, how can you get blood from a turnip? How can you squeeze blood from a turnip? So he got it, but this was the message that he was being given by his superiors. Another officer suggested, why not let them use the money to, you know, fix their broken taillights rather than add on fines and then haul them into court? That's not the way it worked in Ferguson. And so officers did receive the message. You know, they understood that they were supposed to be ticketing, and they did multiple ticketing on individual stops. 2, 4, 6, 8 tickets. In one case, 14 tickets on a single traffic stop. I thought that was the most that existed, because that's the most that I found when I was digging through the records. Darren Wilson then did an interview with the New Yorker, and in that interview, you can read the article, he says that there was a time he remembers where there were 16 tickets issued on a particular stop. So I'm going to give him he's the expert on this, so I'm going to say 16 tickets was the max. And they used to charge these offenses under the municipal code, even when there was a corresponding state law code that would have applied, and offenses were violent in nature. So I've been mentioning some traffic offenses, but there were lots of other offenses that were charged that could have been charged under state law as well, where officers understood that the likely penalty was a fine and not, say, jail time. They would charge that as a municipal code so that the money would end up going to local coffers. And all of this had the desired impact. As you can see from the next slide, the city's coffers swelled. Revenue generation from fines and fees grew from 1.38 million in fiscal year 2010 to a projected 3.09 million in fiscal year 2015. It's a massive rise. Now, they didn't get to that $3.1 million figure because Mike Brown was shot, the world started paying attention, DOJ did its investigation, but they did get to 2.5 million the year before. The focus on revenue generation is important because it helps explain how policing went so off the rails in Ferguson. It explains how Ferguson's policing came to be overly aggressive, unmoored from community relationships, and likely to cross the constitutional line in everyday encounters. I actually think it has a lot to say about why we also saw excessive force in Ferguson, because police officers ended up seeing and treating people as sources of revenue, as people who should obey commands, rather than people who were there to be served by them, the police. The municipal court, meanwhile, didn't serve as a check on the system, but rather was a critical part of the revenue generation machine. So here you can see a picture here of the municipal court, which, by the way, is housed in the police department. And for until our investigation and until we pointed this out, the court clerk of the municipal court reported directly to the police chief. And so very intertwined relationship here, not a neutral arbiter of the law. This quote here is directly from the Ferguson report. Ferguson has allowed its focus on revenue generation to fundamentally compromise the role of Ferguson's municipal court. Fines were deliberately set at or above those in surrounding areas, and there were internal documents where court officials bragged about setting the rates higher than in other places. $302 for jaywalking, $427 for disturbing the peace, $531 for allowing high weeds or grass to grow in your lawn. Yes, that is a criminal offense in Ferguson. And not just Ferguson. One of the dangers of telling the Ferguson story is that people think that this is an outlier, but jurisdictions all around that St. Louis area and throughout the country do similar things. When a defendant would miss a court date or a payment, the municipal court would issue an arrest warrant. Often the person hadn't received notice. There was no evidence that the person had received notice of the court date. And there was no inquiry at all done into a person's ability to pay. Rather, an arrest warrant went out and the person was hauled in. When they were brought in, they were left to sit in jail until they could post bail. Again, no inquiry was conducted into their ability to afford bail, which was set based on a schedule that just matched up the number of charges you had. You know, if you had 5 tickets on you, it would match up to $100 or $200 depending on the level of the charge. You would sit there for a couple days in jail and you'd say you couldn't afford it, but they would just leave you there. And then after a couple of days, they would lower your bail and see if you could afford that. A couple more days, you couldn't afford that, they would just let you out. It shows you that the bail wasn't about preventing people, ensuring that people would reappear for court, you know, avoid flight, or ensuring the safety of the community. It was rather about extracting money from people. There were a host of other municipal court due process problems that we uncovered in this investigation. Just a quick note about warrants. I mentioned warrants. Ferguson issued a massive number of warrants. 9,000 people alone in the year 2013 got warrants issued on them. This is a city of 21,000 people. Some of those are going to be people who came from surrounding jurisdictions who were passing through Ferguson, but it's still an incredibly high rate. People's licenses were also automatically suspended under state law for missing a payment. Again, this is meant to extract the money from people. There's no relationship between being unable to pay your fines on high weeds and grass and whether you should be able to drive on the city or state roads. And yet that was a mechanism that was used and is used throughout the United States to try to get people to pay their fines and fees. Let me just briefly, if I can take a couple more minutes, to cover here the racial disparities across the board on all the metrics that I mentioned right now. Here you can see that African Americans constitute 2/3 of the population of Ferguson. So 2/3 black, 1/3 white. Vehicle stops, there were 85% of people stopped. There were 90% of people who were issued citations and 93% of people who were arrested. Next slide, you can see these are up here, but I'm going to go through them. More than twice black people in Ferguson and around Ferguson were more than twice as likely to be searched during vehicle stops, but 26% less likely to possess contraband, to be found in possession of contraband. This is what we call a hit rate. So this is a good response to the skepticism that some people may have in comparing just enforcement rates to population rates, because sometimes people say, well, maybe black people are committing more of the crimes. This is telling you they're being pulled over at higher rates and being found with contraband less. So either these police officers are just woefully incompetent at their jobs, or they're using race as a predictor, as a factor in determining who to stop and search. Another good additional metric to look at to respond to account for that reality that sure, maybe some groups are committing more crime than others, is to look at discretionary offenses that virtually all of us commit, and the police can ticket or arrest any of us for. One of those is jaywalking. Manner of walking in roadway is what Ferguson calls that. It actually was what Mike Brown was doing at the time that Darren Wilson stopped him. I jaywalked a couple times on the way over here. I jaywalked 3 or 4 times a day. I haven't been ticketed or arrested yet. In Ferguson, 95% of people who were charged with jaywalking were black. 88% of the people that the police used force against, and I'm telling you this from direct experience, I looked at every single force report over a 5-year period in Ferguson, was black. And 100% of the people, every single time that police used a canine to apprehend someone, which means a bite, the person bitten was black. So, you see the same disparities on the court side. I'll put them up here. You can just see that if you were black in Ferguson, you were less likely to have your cases dismissed, more likely for your case to go to warrant, much more likely to have warrants issued on your case and to be arrested on those warrants. And there were a number of other metrics that we looked at as well, where basically the racial disparities were pervasive. Now, that actually is quite common to find racial disparities in the investigations that DOJ did of police. What is less common is to be able to prove intentional discrimination. Usually we have to proceed on a disparate impact theory under a certain statute that allows that. The Constitution requires that you have evidence of intentional discrimination if you're going to bring an equal protection claim, which we did end up bringing in this case because we did find pretty strong evidence of discriminatory intent on the part of the police department. And I'll just give you a couple examples of that. One is the consistency and extent of the disparities in police and court treatment of black people, especially with regard to discretionary practices, so what I just covered with you. Another was officers' apparent tendency to factor race into their assessment of threat. And this is a little harder to show you in the slides, but you can see this when you read arrest reports and the way that officers talk about threats in cases. And we looked at cases where subjects were white versus subjects were black, and officers perceived threats to be very different. There's one very high-profile incident of a massive bar brawl of all white people, in which one person had his ear bitten off, and there was just a lot of violence at that, and I think one person was arrested during that whole night. And that was in stark contrast to the situations where subjects were black in Ferguson Police Department. Another is that we actually found direct evidence of stereotyping, and I'll throw up a couple of these. The next slide here, I think you may have to click through each of them here. If you can go backward a little bit, just so people, I'll put these up here so you can see them. They're highly offensive, so I want to apologize to everybody that you have to see this in the audience. But basically, the email evidence also turned up dehumanizing depictions of people of color, usually transmitted as jokes within Ferguson, between high-level people, lieutenants, other commanders, head court clerk. You know, one email depicted President Obama as a chimpanzee. Another, and that one's going to come in a minute. Another joked about a man who applied for welfare for his dogs because they are, quote, mixed in color, unemployed, lazy, can't speak English, and have no friggin' clue who their daddies are. Another email joked about a black woman receiving $5,000 from Crime Stoppers for having an abortion. In addition, Ferguson officials routinely blamed racial outcomes, the disparate racial outcomes, on the lack of personal responsibility for black people. This is a common refrain. They would say, well, if it just took personal responsibility, they wouldn't be in this situation. You know, they wouldn't have, I guess, had high weeds in their lawn. They would have paid those fines. They wouldn't have missed the payments. And we found evidence that they didn't apply these Ferguson officials didn't apply this same frame of personal responsibility when it came to white people who had missed payments or who were trying to get out of tickets. In fact, we found a number of examples where the same court clerk who said those kinds of things about personal responsibility for people who are black was fixing tickets for people who are white in the community, basically getting them off. And that is something that's pervasive in America, this narrative of personal responsibility. So I think it was meaningful that we were able to find some evidence, to use that as evidence in this case, because it has application elsewhere. So I've gone on a bit long, but let me just step back here and say a couple of lessons. It wasn't, the main takeaway for me for the Ferguson report here is that it wasn't one police shooting of an unarmed black man that led to thousands of people taking to the streets. That was the match. We actually heard that in the video. If you remember at the beginning, someone says Rodney King was the verdict was the match, right? It was years and years of mistreatment by LAPD that was the powder keg. And you see the same thing here. The powder keg was the years of abuse and a system that targeted people who were overwhelmingly poor and black in Ferguson. Another lesson from my work more broadly at DOJ is that Ferguson isn't unique. We heard these kinds of stories, sometimes with the policing for profit element, but sometimes not, from communities around America. We routinely got complaints. We had far more cases that we could have investigated than we did. We opened 25 of these investigations over the course of the Obama administration. And had we had more personnel, we would have done more. Another lesson for me is that individual accountability is really important. I care deeply about it. I spend a lot of my time thinking about how to have accountability in these individual incidents of excessive force. But we shouldn't overemphasize that, lest we play into this false narrative that it's just a few bad apples who are engaged in misconduct. The central problem in policing is not of bad apples, but of rotten barrels. And I don't mean to say that all police are bad or that policing as a profession is illegitimate. I mean that the mistreatment that we've been talking about here, the indignities that people experience, the wealth extraction that you see in communities of color is a result of policy, not of individual officers, right? It is usually civilian decision makers who are often elected, sometimes appointed, and sometimes top brass in police departments who are setting policy that is resulting in this kind of abuse. So yes, we should have individual accountability, but we should also look at people beyond that line officer. Who is it that set the priorities that led to a situation where people are being shot in their own backyard 20 times? And with that, I'll stop.
Thank you. Great.
I'm going to be very brief because so as to join the conversation or to have some sort of exchange, and because that very, very excellent and detailed presentation.
Sorry. Third time's a charm.
Okay.
There we
go.
Okay.
I think that much of my talk, having heard the extraordinary thoroughness and the beautiful tightness of that presentation, I don't wish to be redundant. And so therefore I'm going to really cut my remarks to the part of the program that talks about what, or the question I think was, is racial discrimination really undermining the rule of law itself? And I think that there are new technologies of discrimination that are at stake, to which I want to address most of of my remarks. At the same time, I just wanted to tell an anecdote, because I happened to be in Ferguson completely accidentally. I was brought in only a couple of days, and I had been booked to speak there at Washington University Law School only days after the Michael Brown event occurred. And although I had been booked almost a year ahead, it was very interesting that the university announced that I was part of what was being handed to the community, that they had a prominent black professor to come and smooth the waters, and I knew nothing about the community. And I observed firsthand the struggle of institutions within this community, which is only 2 miles away from downtown St. Louis, deal with how to reconcile how little they knew that community. And one of the best examples of that to me was a faculty member there, a colleague who came up to me and said, I wanted to let you know that one of the responses of the university was to do a canned food drive. They gathered, they put canned, big boxes for canned food for the people of Ferguson in their hour of distress. So this faculty member said she went around her house and she got cans of string beans and peas and she put them in a little big bag, and she came into her office that morning and she plunked it in the corner. And then a student came in and started crying about the fact that she had missed a deadline and could she possibly get an extension. And she said, ordinarily I'd have reached for some Kleenex, but in this instance she reached for a can of peas and handed it to her and said, here, this will help with your distress. And she said the irony at that moment really struck her, that it was just about as effective to give a can of peas to the people of Ferguson, and that is an institutional response, while not completely wanting to disparage the effort for people who were missing work and so forth. But the institution really had no knowledge of that community. It wasn't Biafra. It wasn't going through a famine. It wasn't going through drought. And in fact, it's a working class community, but it is not a completely impoverished community. But that was the response to which they reached, because they really didn't know what was going on. There was such a class as well as a race divide, that this community through which people have to drive on their way from the airport was like, their stereotype of, sub-Saharan drought conditions. So I think that for me, one of the things, is not just who we fear, but when we fear because we don't know. And that's certainly an affliction of police, but although in terms of how the, and particularly police who do not live in the neighborhood, police who are not part of the same culture or communities, this comes up over and over again. It is a feature, I think, not simply of stand your ground statistics, as in the George Zimmerman case, where certain people get the presumption of innocence in being able to stand their ground, and other particular people, particularly women and minorities, are assumed to intimidate. Their embodiments intimidate, do not have the power to claim public space as defensible in the same way. I thought another example of this was Nicholas Cruz, who was somebody who had every warning sign in the world. Flags of fluttering, white, red flags, black flags, white flags fluttering in terms of somebody who should have had some sort of intervention years and years ago. And I kept contrasting that with some statistics I was reading that one of my graduate students gave me of kindergartners in Stockton or Meridian, Mississippi, who are literally dragged out by school police officers with the handcuffs on their upper arms because their wrists are too small for the handcuffs, because they have thrown a tantrum in the classroom at the age of 5 or 6, or to quote one of the police reports, a notorious kindergartner. And so these contrasts in terms of who we perceive and how are obviously something that must be addressed. I'm a particular fan of Philip Atiba Goff's work, who is now head of a program at John Jay College as part of the City University of New York, who does some very interesting neuropsychiatric work with police officers. So for example, he shows that when police are running, when they have engaged in a chase, their cortisol levels, their stress receptors are on high alert, and they are the statistics of shootings after a foot chase, as in Baltimore, skyrocket. And therefore, he's trying to build into models of how police are trained some sense of restraint about those moments. Now, of course, all of that assumes that police are going to be trained, that we are going to invest in that kind of police training. Because surely we know, we know how to train police officers better than many of the ways in which police officers are trained in various localities. And we know that certain features, like putting quotas on arrests, actually rewarding people for simple numbers rather than for actual probable cause. We know that putting the kinds of quotas that Donald Trump wants to put on immigration judges is going to lead to a lack of the ability to present evidence, because that judge wants you in and out because of his quota, because there is self-interest built into the model. We know, when I was a prosecutor, I thought that had been taken care of. I began my career as a prosecutor in Los Angeles, and we had quotas at that time, and of course it was counter to the best interests of the public or the state, to which we are beholden, rather than our own merit pay. But all of that, what we know and what we're willing to implement, is one set of problems. One of the things that worries me most, and again, I'm not a criminal, my specialty is not criminal law, but what I have been concerned about rather is I'm actually a contracts teacher, believe it or not. And so the concern that I have is the outsourcing and the lack of accountability and the prioritization, the proprietary interests that are now driving many of the metrics by which policing, sentencing, and everything else are being governed. That is to say, and I don't know whether this was mentioned earlier before I came in, the degree to which not just the financial material is being put into great algorithmic vats and then understood as as simply data points rather than actual events in real time with real people, but the way in which private companies are now providing metrics based on data points that are not made public, and therefore there is no accountability for those. And yet those calculations are being used to determine whether somebody gets out on bail or whether somebody gets probation. And it would appear that those data sets include things like where one lives, who one associates with, what the recidivism rate is for somebody who falls within your class category. But that's not an evaluation of the individual, and that's, I think, a real undermining of due process, which is based on cases and controversies of real individuals. Another example that again, with which those of you who are actually do criminal law are probably much more familiar, is Boston's gang assessment metrics, whereby, and I think there's a 10-point system that the police are allowed to take into account in determining whether somebody is a gang associate, which is one level, and then a gang member. I mean, there are these levels of gangitude, so to speak, based on a 10-point metric. And use or possession of group paraphernalia or identifiers is like 4 points. So if you're wearing red, you're already almost halfway to gangs, to full-fledged 10-point gang membership. If you have a group-related photograph, that's 2 points. So that means that if you go to an underserved school that is filled with people who may not, that have already been targeted or already on this sort of register, and you have and you take a picture with them on Facebook, then you get another 2 points. I mean, simply photos with people who are not just gang members but gang related. It doesn't, information from an anonymous informant is, it has a point value. Possession of gang publications is 2 points. And again, I assume this does not apply to their teachers or to researchers like myself, so when I get sort of, when I'm online, I'm sure that somewhere there is another kind of point system, and that actually worries me because this is clearly not a system limited to police departments. It is also the kind of information that Facebook gathers on us all right now, as Cambridge Analytica has shown. It is a formal system in China, the so-called social credit system, where everything you do, whether it's your grades in high school, whether it's your jaywalking, is used as an incentive or disincentive system, so that if you score enough points, then you get, literally discounts at hotels. I mean, for rectitude, for social rectitude. And if you have fewer points, or if for example, I think there was a case recently in which you, if you're seen at a political gathering that the state doesn't like, you can't board an airplane or a train or rent a car. So the ability to control, I think, is something which is settling around us increasingly. We are not yet that model, but we certainly have the data capacities to become that model, which for many people seems to be, for the techno-optimists among us in the United States, well, there's nothing to worry about if you don't do anything wrong. I do worry that we are not looking at the way in which not just the way in which the data is being gathered, but the way in which, for example, gang assessment is a 10-point system, which is much, much too easy, has very little accountability, but also there is no real accountability for getting off that system. There's no real point for doing something different with it. We don't have like a good guy assessment system that's right along that. Yes, I was born to a gang member, but on the other hand, I'm really trying, and therefore I should get some brownie points. I mean, there's no brownie point system. There's no accompanying system. And so to some degree, what it's really doing is redlining human bodies. I mean, it's redlining. It's more insidious even than the redlining system of yore, in that it can combine both geographic segregation with political association, a la McCarthy, with financial information, class information, and do so ostensibly in the name of racial neutrality. The degree to which this is inflicted on particular neighborhoods, even as it's described as race neutral, is perhaps particularly visible in the New York. There's a great deal of literature on the stop and frisk program in New York, which has been critiqued and is to some degree in check in recent years under the current mayor. But Harry Levine, who is the sociologist who was largely responsible for gathering the data that actually showed that 750,000 people, 750,000 people were being stopped and frisked every year, has also done a companion one, because he said with stop and frisk, the thing was always, well, if they have minute qualities of marijuana. And so it never really, even those numbers never gathered the sympathy, even if it was largely black people. Well, they just smoke more marijuana. And marijuana is against the law, even if it's only an infraction, or small amounts are only an infraction. So he started to collect data on what you described as discretionary offenses. Bicycles on sidewalks. And so he went through Park Slope, which is a lovely gentrified neighborhood with very upscale these days. In the course of a year, there might have been 8 stops and arrests or citations for walking or riding a bicycle on sidewalks. In the South Bronx, within the same period, there were thousands for riding a bicycle or walking a bicycle, or even just using a bicycle to go up the front stairs of your stoop. So these geographic markers, these mappings are again, if there's an optimistic use of technology, the Justice Mapping Project, which is also out of Columbia, which mapped the $1 million blocks in New York of where policing where the money for policing is most spent. It seems to me, at least it illuminates these otherwise fairly invisible or unremarked uses of data. Finally, one of the things that bothers me as well about an increasingly algorithmic world, which displaces our actual embodiments with the probabilities of who we are, is that even that system of risk assessment is being displaced by yet another system that I think completely undermines our current rule of law. That is to say, our justice system, particularly our criminal justice system, is almost based on a temporal gaze. That is to say, it is based on what we have done, on what we might have said or acted in ways that are based on empirically based threats of what we might do, or what we have done. That is to say, it's present tense or it looks in the past. And we get either punished or we get confined from the public geography so that the public geography is a safe space. The problem I have with gang assessment is that it centers on only particular populations, not entire populations, and then assesses what they are probably going to do, not on what they have done, but again, based only on associational stuff, and it looks to the future. And the future is what worries me. Those probabilities are not based on anything that is embodied in that particular person. But even that kind of risk assessment is being displaced by the kind of thing there's a good article in Cultural Anthropology recently about Israel's so-called turning point system, which is a general system of securitization, which is appropriate perhaps for war, but it's not appropriate for a domestic policing system, again, with this temporal sense of what it is that we are remediating. Turning point assesses not just actual empirical risk, it assesses uncertainty generally. So it displaces empirical risk assessment with calculations of uncertainty. So we don't know, I mean, the next shoe bomber is not going to use his shoes. He might use his underwear. And we can't really calculate the probability that it's going to be, sewn in the hem of a dress, or it's going to be dropped by a drone. I mean, we live in a very uncertain world, and therefore, this is a system that ditches the empirical assessment of probability for acting out or living series of fictionalized disaster events, and then deciding how you can possibly respond to them. And so it's a model that ultimately ends up with a sense of necessity for hyper control. Because it's so unpredictable, you have to take care of literally everything. And that's a kind of thinking that brings all the future potential disasters into the present tense. And that anticipatory habit of bringing all the potential future disasters unmoored from the probability of their actually happening is a kind of policy justification for covering all the bases in ways that confine us quite substantially. And I think that that's the direction that worries me. And again, just to focus on that temporality of that as a remedial scheme, it undermines and it bears much more resemblance to spy systems. What spies do is that they anticipate what's going to do, and therefore their mission becomes to undermine anticipatorily. That's not the function of domestic police. Domestic policing is to reconcile, to bring society together, to do what is constitutional, which is to say, to assess what constitutes us, what's constitutive of a society. But a war mentality really does seek to undermine all the possible undermining influences across a border. When we bring that within our borders, it seems to me it breaks apart the constitutiveness of how we of how our rule of law and how our due process, the process due to people, sort of evaporates in an eternal state of emergency that is past, present, and the indefinite future. So I'll start.
Thank you. All right. So I'm sure that audience members have lots of questions, comments, observations, and we're going to ask our speakers to come up behind the table, and I will come to you, Phil Donahue style.
First and foremost, I'm hoping that Chief of Police, Boston Chief of Police, Mr. Evans, has a friend in this room. I would like the friend to communicate this message to him. As an observer of some of the challenges the police face in Boston, I used to be one of his admirers. I used to think that so far under his leadership, we've been able to avoid some of the disasters associated with most of the cities. But I was very disappointed when about a month ago, a young black man was walking through one of the neighborhoods, and the police officer sits in the SUV and tells him, hey, what are you doing? It's like, I'm working as a police officer and you are roaming the streets without working. I saw two videos, one in which I think the police chief did the right thing by saying the police officer didn't behave well. In the other video, he uses the phrase like, oh, the two of them used language that was inappropriate. Why am I saying this? I have been a vice provost of this university. At some point, I was part of the management team of this university. I've chaired the department. I've had many international academic awards. But I've had this experience. I was somewhere in Weston when somebody called the police on me. The difference between me and my colleagues being shot is I'm not from here. So as soon as the police officer approached me, I took off my baseball cap. And then when he asked me for an ID, I didn't take out my Massachusetts driver's license. I took out my Northeastern driver's license. And then he goes, oh, I also go to school at Northeastern. I said, no, I'm a professor at Northeastern. That changed the dynamics. Second, last week of 2016, I was again in the neighborhood, going to pick up a car from the shop. Two police officers got out of their car, came to me and said, what are you doing here? I said, I'm doing business here. Then they go like, oh, we have a report that somebody's opening mailboxes. I took out my driver's license and I showed them my address. Surprisingly, they didn't say anything. But before they left, I said, is it because of my skin color? And nothing happened. In fact, I was very, very furious. I almost went to the police chief's office, but I thought that would be a waste of my time. First and foremost, those of us who always say things like, you're being too passionate about these things, we should quit that. because there are people's lives at stake. One of the things I find very interesting, and I hope our
Wait.
panelists-
Is there a question?
Yeah, I have a question. Why is it that if some of the way some of my people have been shot, if the way some black people have been shot in this country, if dogs were shot like that, those police officers would not have gone to their desks. Why are those police officers back at their desk? I'd like to cite two examples. Staten Island, Eric Gardner.
Wait. Let them answer the question.
I have two questions. So the first question is, if dogs were shot like the way some of us have been shot, the shooters would not be at their desks. They would definitely not go back. Does it mean we care more about dogs than other people? Two, with the young man that was put in the police van in Baltimore, that's a clear case of neglect. They broke his leg. So why were the police officers not found criminally liable? Thank you.
Well, the first question seems like a rhetorical question, and I think I have less to add than you did on that. And I thought that was a very eloquent set of comments. This doesn't work, huh? Okay. Yeah, I thought that was a very eloquent set of comments. I mean, I agree with a fair bit of what you said, so I'm going to just let it sit. The one thing I'll say on the Freddie Gray case, which is the case you referenced with Baltimore, why were the officers acquitted there? There was not, the charges there were essentially required the officers to have engaged in some kind of misconduct. Officer misconduct was the lowest level charge. I think second degree, I can't remember exactly, but it was a form of homicide. It may have been manslaughter, second degree manslaughter, or it may have been higher than that was charged as well. What happened there is that the state judge who was trying the case ended up acquitting the officers who came before him. That particular judge actually thought, from what I could see, gave a fair shake to the case. That judge used to work in the part of the Civil Rights Division that prosecuted police officers, and so himself has had experience.
Has had experience in prosecuting police officers. Without going through all the evidence, it's hard to say exactly why he came out the way he did, but it seemed that the state was not able to put on adequate evidence to reach the beyond the reasonable doubt standard of evidence in a criminal case. Essentially, their case boiled down to he was alive when he went into the van, and he was dead at the end of it. And there were the theory was a rough ride, that is that the officers were driving the van in a particular way on purpose to get him to be injured. But there wasn't actually much evidence of the car being driven in a rough way. The video evidence that did exist didn't show that. So you may be right that there was neglect, but the state, it seemed, didn't have enough evidence to prove to the judge. Most of these cases were then decided by the judge. They started with the jury, went to the judge, but beyond the reasonable doubt standard. I can't explain it more than that, but maybe that adds a little bit of context.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Samuel, last name is Ihemdi. I've been living in Massachusetts for the past 40 years of my life. I don't work here. I'm an alumni who is very actively involved in this institution, committed to this institution, graduated from this institution. And my son graduated 2 years ago from here with his bachelor's and master's degree in engineering. He's now at Yale doing his PhD. Now, when I look at all this, professionally, I graduated here with a pharmacy degree and then went to medical school and the School of Public Health and the School of Public Administration and then so on. What I'm hearing from here is what I've always had. And it appears that the discussion here is focused on case control studies with no cohorts. What am I saying? What I'm saying is that we point the problem, the incident, someone has been killed, and then we latch on that, and then the policeman becomes he becomes the public policy person who is out there to do harm rather than protecting people. I'm not a policeman. There are police people that do bad things. They have done it to me many times. So that's not, Have you been, traveling overseas? Travel overseas and you're black and get to Logan Airport here and see what happens. Most of which I have the statistics, I gather when I'm coming in there. On one occasion I was in a plane, 747, carrying close to 400 passengers. We landed there, I'm the only black the people who are the custom officers who were here, or they came to me right away. Said, I said, wait a minute, hold on. Did the rule change? He said to me, what do you mean? I said, I don't have my luggage. What are you going to search? What are you going to look for? If I don't have my luggage, why are you looking for me? And I dragged him. That was when Patrick was the governor. I said, look at that picture there. Who is that person? And Obama was the president. I said, well, look at that picture. What does that say? Well, so what am I saying here? The question we as a society should and must answer is, why is it that a policeman, obviously most of which are whites, happens to be panic or go into overdrive or flight-to-flight reaction when it's the person in front of him is black, rather than blaming the police after the effect or saying, oh gee, why is he still on his desk, like my friend here said? He shouldn't be on his desk given what he did, obviously. No question about that. But the question is why? And nobody, this is something I've seen in war, in this country as a whole. Nobody's answering that. Nobody's addressing that. This is the only country on earth that, where you go to school is a function of where you live. If you go to school in a burn-out building, a crack house, fine, of course you're going to smoke crack. If you go to school, every single thing is so segregated, stratified in such a way that you go. I went to Newton High School. It's like university here. Just walk down there's how many steps from here? Go into the IMC. The standard deviation is just so great. The question then becomes, why? If I don't interact with you, you don't know that I'm a human being. I have a son that I'm just telling you.
Wait. Let them answer, please.
Okay. Can I continue? Okay. So anyway, the question is this. It's very clear that we are all guilty of this sin of horror. And the only way to eliminate it is if you teach our children when they are kids, can go to school together, and they don't see one another. They have no idea that there are some black people who are, as smart as the general population. So there's no way we cannot solve this by punitive action, by point estimates. We have to change the society. The system has to change. Last time I was in this hall here, they released a statistic that the average net worth of blacks in the city of Boston is $8. $8.
All right, I have to interrupt. Every one of us in this room who's a person of color can offer a testimonial as to the abuse we've taken. We have before us individuals who have sought to do some systematic analysis of the roots of that, so that our dialogue here can go beyond simply stating what the problem is and to try to address what some of the solutions are. And hopefully we can address those with sufficient specificity so that we don't simply conclude that society has to change. So I'd like to give our presenters the opportunity to respond to what it is you're saying, particularly for the benefit of folks who may not have grown up here, particularly for the global students who are here who may be experiencing and hearing some of this for the first time. And as much as I think it's important for each and every one of us to have the opportunity to offer a testimonial, it's important to have some dialogue as well, okay? So, let me turn this over to our presenters.
I mean, I'll start and answer with the broadest possible address, which is that, you know, the reason that most of the 20th century was taken up with trying to integrate schools was precisely for this reason. I mean, from Brown, I mean, Linda Brown just died a week and a half ago. She was the figurehead of an attempt to address this. You know, this week, the first week of April, it marks, you know, the assassination of Martin Luther King, the letter from a Birmingham jail. So much of that attempt to integrate, a lot of it was about education, a lot of it was about police abuse in the beginning in Alabama, a lot of it was about the numbers of bombings, but it, you know, the root causes of it do distinguish America in its system of untouchability, in this system of not just separate but equal, which really began after sort of Reconstruction in the beginning of the 20th century, but built upon and institutionalized a kind of anti-misogynist instinct that goes back to colonial times. And I do think that the anti-miscegenationist instinct is not simply about you can't get married, but a weird sense of taboo, at which, at the heart of which, we still express it in terms of who's afraid of whom in this society, because it is almost a matter of touchability and affect. I mean, and I think that there's a growing, that's why I like Philip Goff's work, because it really is about this growing study of how affect has been inculcated through a system of trauma and violence in this country that really distinguishes our racial responses in ways that are profoundly different from perhaps some other places in the world. There's a colonial response, you know, when I go to France, for example, but it's different from this sense, I mean, or in Britain, but it's different. Just, and you see this in all kinds of, almost the sensoria of our bodies in terms of how close you can get, and it's particularly visible, again, in our geographic separation. But the studies of, you know, those studies of untouchability feed into stereotypes of black men as bestial. They feed into even our theories of creationism. America is the place that actually pioneered and developed and where it took hold. That's why you don't see creationism being so much of a fight in other countries. It began in the United States with scientific racism, which says that God actually created two batches of human beings. Now it's being exported all over the world through certain evangelical and histories, but nevertheless, this was a religious belief that God left the first batch in the oven too long, polygenesis, and then made another batch. And that's why, you know, blacks are so likened to monkeys and chimpanzees, which was a trope, you know, read onto the history of both the Irish and the Jews in medieval times, but nevertheless in the United States, it took hold as a kind of untouchability that had weird responses, like John Hope Franklin writes about three Southerners go out on a boat and they're rowing, and two of them are white, one is black, and they can socialize. They're all sort of working class, lower class in the 19-teens. They were out in the middle of the lake. They break out their lunch buckets. The white guys put an oar over the center of the boat so that the black man eats on one side and the two white people eat on the other. This has been exported to South Africa. It's certainly prevalent in our modern world, but it began as that kind of fear of smell, sight, touch, hypersexualization. And you see that over and over again in the tribes. And when Darren Walker described him, he's a monster, he's big, he's huge, he's hulky, he's supernatural. And it seems to me that that's very, very much a part of not just who's a citizen, not just who's 3/5 of a human being under our Constitution, but who's human. But who's human? And that's just very, very powerful in this country, and it is, and we, I think it's the consequence of trauma, and I think part of the intractability is not obviously just about police-citizen encounters. It's about white Americans and how you've been trained to hold your breath around black people from the time you were so small. And you know, you see a black person on the other side of the store, and you get afraid that that's in the body, and that's trauma, and that's not going to be addressed simply by addressing police. It is.
Yes, my question. That means we should surrender. There is no need for any intervention holding police accountable here and there and there.
I can't hear you.
Oh, what I'm saying is, if in fact it is a function of, there's something we call autotropism or allotropism. If it's a function of that's whom we are, that means we are going
No, I'm
nowhere.
not saying that's who we are. I'm saying that's who we are trained to be, and that is very easily, it could be easily addressed. We don't want to.
That's correct, but that's classical conditioning. We are conditioned to be, whom we are. But, we can change it. The
Yes.
dynamics can change.
Yeah.
I have friends, all of which are whites. My wife is white. So, why is it that, I see this, I see him there, I start to get paranoia. I mean, that shouldn't be the case.
All right.
Something
It
is
shouldn't
wrong.
be the case, but it is. Student in the back.
Yeah, my question is regarding who the police are. Just a little background. So, I mean, in the United States, I guess, so the U.S. military, when it goes abroad, has been found time and again, and fairly recently, has been known to like kill people for fun, killing black and brown bodies in places like Afghanistan, in Iraq, and yet, you got torture like Abu Ghraib. And when those soldiers come back, even with their PTSD, they come back to the United States and they have a veteran's preference in civil service jobs. And a lot of them take law enforcement jobs. So when we have soldiers going abroad and developing this mantra, and it's seen in things like American Sniper, where they're trained to hate black and brown bodies, and they come back and they're policing black and brown bodies, the same ones they were shooting in Afghanistan, with the same military equipment that they're given in Afghanistan here in America. Should we be expecting, I mean, like if we give, former military people the same equipment and the same mentality in American streets, should we be expecting anything different?
In our session for matriculating students that takes place before this, we had a conversation about who becomes a police officer in this country, how police officers are recruited, and how they're trained in a way that could help to offset some of the larger systemic issues that we're dealing with. Could you folks comment on that?
Yeah. I just want to bring together a couple of things and also address that question. This question of what can we do? Can we do anything? What can we do? What do solutions look like? That was a big part of the police reform program under the previous administration. That program is virtually shut down or shutting down now, but there are some valuable lessons learned. The approach to reform involved not just telling whatever jurisdiction we found that there was a pattern of practice of misconduct, hey, please follow the constitutional law here, because that doesn't work, right? They were always obligated to follow the Constitution, and yet there were violations. But rather looking at what are the systems that either haven't been in place or that were broken, that need to be instituted or repaired in order to prevent this kind of conduct from continuing. Because usually these, the type of misconduct we found, again, I firmly believe wasn't just the product of individual bad actors, but really things going off the rails as a system. So The solutions usually came in the form of a federal court order, which we call a consent decree. It's like a settlement agreement that becomes a court order, so there's a judge overseeing the whole thing. And it's court enforceable, so that if the defendant, meaning the city, doesn't do what it's supposed to do, the judge can issue sanctions, can haul them before the court to say, why haven't you met these deadlines on implementing these systems? Yeah, can impose monetary sanctions, can even institute personnel changes. And the solutions really ranged quite far from policy, so what is written in policy, what are police supposed to do on the street on a day-to-day basis, to training, how are they trained, to answer your question, to accountability systems, when are they held accountable, what is the process for that, how swift should it be, to hiring, recruitment, and promotion. So just to look at that and training, there are a number of things that can be done differently. And just let me pick one thing. So recruitment, who becomes a police officer? I was once in a conference of police chiefs a couple of years ago, and they were talking about this very issue, recruitment. Who is it that becomes a police officer? And one police chief talked about a couple of different recruitment videos that he had seen over time. And he gave two examples. One was a recruitment video where the video showed officers scaling the side of a building in an urban setting and then dropping down through the roof and doing a raid on the building, the apartment building, which doesn't actually happen very frequently, at least not in that manner. There are a lot of police raids, sometimes for low-level business, but usually not scaling the side of the building and dropping it like you see on television. It made for a really exciting video, though. The other video was just started with a picture of the brain. And it then said, this is the most important tool you have at your disposal as a police officer. And you can just imagine what different types of pools you might get through those recruitment videos. So one, you might get someone who's up for adventure, who sees this as something where they get to exercise power and do the kinds of things you see on television. And the other, you might get someone who's much more interested in problem solving and addressing the community's needs and being creative and not resorting to force immediately. You know, it's a simple example, and it's obviously the world is much more complex than that, and the world of who gets recruited to be a police officer involves much more than recruitment videos. But I thought it was a nice illustration for how we could go about doing things differently and just pivoting in terms of who we want to bring on as police officers. And I will also just say I have met a lot of police officers who fall into that second category. There actually are quite a lot of people like that. It just should be that we should have more of them, and they should be promoted, and they should be running police departments much more frequently.
And it does take a certain kind of will to implement those kinds of training programs. And at every level, I mean, Charles Grainer, who was depicted as being one of the people who was, he was the man who tortured so many people in Abu Ghraib and took photos and was laughing and had his, he, with his girlfriend, had the thumbs up. But he had a long history of torture. He was a prison guard before he went into the army. He had a long history of torturing and putting razor blades and calling racial epithets before he ever left the United States. So there was a failure of recruitment and a failure of training, or a failure of weeding out people with seriously psychopathic tendencies well before that. He has now served his time and he's out, I believe, at this point. And I heard some, and again, I have to really verify this. I heard that he's trying to apply for private security, and that's just as the woman who oversaw it is now auditioning apparently for Secretary of what is she?
Director of CIA.
Director of CIA. Yeah. War traumatizes, policing traumatizes, and again, it seems to me that it's not unpredictable if we don't take measures, not just to prepare people, but once exposed to the inevitable violence and terrifying situations into which we put them in a society that's loaded with guns, if we don't provide also counseling, backup, and the ability for them to come and seek help and be removed from the force till such time as they can recover from that. And I don't think we begin to do that at all. And we've never done it. I mean, we haven't done it particularly since we got rid of the right. I'm somebody who actually believes we need some sort of national service at every level, so that these kinds of, military service or policing, which is frightening work, doesn't become the catch-all for people who can do nothing else or who sort of enjoy the image of doing the adventure, who's sort of reiterating the kind of adventure narrative. But since the Vietnam War, remember Robert McNamara lowered the standards for being in the military to include people with very, very marginal cognitive abilities as well as mental, the filter for proclivities for violence. There were whole platoons because there were so few people who were enrolling, and it was called McNamara's morons, actually. And it's a horrible phrase, but literally that was because they were not functioning well. And we are doing somewhat of the same thing now, I think, and that's, people don't want to enroll in these wars, and yet at the same time we're ramping up, and the supply and demand effect is not serving us well.
So let me ask a related question in reference to the comments you made about classifying individuals who might be engaged with gangs at a variety of levels. My understanding is that Boston introduced those kinds of classifications in part to address the issue you raise around the knowledge of police officers of the extent to which any person who might be associated with a gang might be viewed as someone who is deeply involved in a way that they might become engaged in violence, as opposed to marginally involved in a way where they could be somehow diverted towards other kinds of activities. And the scales that were developed more to identify people at the margins of gang membership than at the core, as a way of then being able to pull them away from that. If that kind of classification were not in place, what would you think would be a better way of engaging with those young people in a way that would mitigate the likelihood of their then becoming more violent individuals?
There are probably others who are more familiar with the system. Again, this is not my field, and so let me preface it with this. My concern is not with the fact that you're taking information about marginalized populations, or as you described it, it sounds quite noble, and that you identify people who are at risk. We need to be identifying people at risk, however one does that. But the question is how everyone does that. And this is a system which, I came across because it is being used to feed people to ICE. So it isn't actually, and when you actually look at the metrics, you could do this. Teachers do this at all over, who's at risk. That's what happened with Nicholas Cruz. Everybody knew he was at risk. These were tangible things you could point to, and you could have a checklist of every, he filled in every box. When I looked at the gang assessment list, my concern, and again, I haven't done the kinds of studies that you've done to really see how it's implemented, but the list of things that are written down as the in that point system weigh very heavily. You can get halfway to 10 on things that you have never done, but just because you were in a particular place. And so that's what worries me. That's the part of it that worries me. It's not that we create metrics, or it's not that we assess. It is the refinement of the assessments, the nuance, it's the actual sophistication of that, and then what you do with it. And if you are going to actually give them, access to counseling, access to social services, better education, integration in after-school programs, that's one outcome. That would be fine. If, on the other hand, this is a database, and this is a critique of technology. That's what concerns me. The system is proprietary to some degree, and so a lot of this gets sold. There's a price on the data, and or as a policy matter, it gets blended with federal or Interpol or international data statistics, and then you have, a president who wants to use it to separate mothers and children or to send people back. But it's not, this is not, you know, these rating systems are not subject to what I think of as due process. You can have a 10-point system based on rumor and accusation by people, there's a category for anonymous tip, and then you get points for somebody's anonymous tip. And that, the consequence of that is the loss of life and liberty as it's being implemented, if I understand that accurately. And again, so let me put that, you know, with that hedge. I'm not as familiar as I might be with the system, but it seems to be, if I read the papers, you know, leading to loss of life and liberty and a careless, effective conviction of people who have done nothing but be born into the wrong geography.
Hi, thank you. I have two short comments, questions, excuse me. What I hope two short questions. Number one, and also from what's been said today. Number one, I have a question about whether you all think there's an overemphasis on training with respect to implicit bias. So, I mean, even with Chiraag's presentation, you sort of saw how there were explicitly racist comments that were laid out from you know, top brass, and that happens across jurisdictions. And even we saw 2016, I think then director James Comey sort of said in so many words that race or that policing in some ways makes officers racist. I mean, that was my interpretation. It's not what he said, but I think that might have been how Professor Williams might have described some of this just moments ago. And forgive me for misunderstanding or misinterpreting your statement, but in light of that, do you think that there's an overemphasis on implicit bias when there's so much evidence, or at least some evidence of explicit racism? And the second question is just, could somebody speak on the role of these testimonies that people offer once they've had these encounters with police, and maybe in Ferguson, what role that played in sort of leading to sort of reconciliation, and what we might be able to learn from other experiences or other contexts where people deal with state violence or state oppression and then voice those concerns in forums that are, you know, reconciliatory.
I do think there's an overemphasis on implicit bias, but I don't think that it is without value. And I think that, you know, I'm suspect of the reason some people overemphasize it, which is that, it's all unconscious and therefore there is no such thing as intentional bias. And so it plugs into that kind of narrative. That's not what I mean. And I think, and having said that, I think there's a wonderful sort of legal historian, sociologist named Jonathan Kahn at Hamline University, and he's writing a book precisely about the misuses of implicit association tests, which instead of being used to document bias, are being used to explain it away as just natural. We all have it. And that's, or displace the empirical studies that would lead to how we then express it consciously or unconsciously. On the other hand, these tests are very valuable in showing that the more exposure you have, that's why I'm so, you know, emphatic about we need to know each other as little kids. The more exposure you have, even minor exposure in adulthood, can blunt some of that unconsciousness and make them more open or less afraid as, you know, as a starting point. So I believe in its value, but I agree that in certain contexts it's definitely overused for other purposes.
Yeah, I really appreciate the question, and I think it raises some astute points. I will say that implicit bias training was a core part of every consent decree that we had at the Justice Department. But I will also say that I am skeptical of emphasizing that as a fix, but not for the same reason that Professor Williams just said, although I agree with that. I mean, it shouldn't be used as a way to say that, you know, that's the only problem, it's just unconscious. It's more that I am skeptical that we can train people out of implicit bias, at least with the way that the trainings operate right now. And for the same reason, I'm skeptical that we can train people out of explicit bias, so that's why I'm not putting emphasis on explicit bias. It's just, I don't think that, I mean, trainings are usually experienced as, you know, an 8-hour training at the academy or in an in-service training. So, you know, you take a day off work and you go have the training. It's often maybe if it's done well by these standards, it's like half lecture training and then half scenario-based training where they've drawn up a scenario and some officers will take it seriously, some won't. You do some role-playing. Some have more sophisticated, I don't want to undersell, some of them have more sophisticated programs, but a lot of the training isn't that good. And a lot of the implicit bias training isn't that great. I've asked the same question of people who do this for a living, and they say there is some decent research on de-biasing techniques that can be done. I'm not sold on that yet, but I'm willing to learn more about it. I haven't seen that be implemented in police departments effectively. I'm much more interested in rules that modify police behavior rather than this sort of training that gets them to see the world differently. Because I think people respond to incentives and rules, and for that reason I actually think sort of accountability and penalties for violating the rules is important, than they do to that kind of encouragement. So just to give an example, we know that the Supreme Court permits the police to conduct pretextual stops. So to stop you, not because, to stop you on the basis of most typically a traffic stop, a traffic violation that they have ample reason to believe that you've committed, when they're really interested in stopping you for some other reason. And when the Supreme Court was thinking about this, they're thinking, well, they have a good reason, they just don't have evidence for it. So they think that you're maybe dealing drugs. But they just see you do an illegal U-turn. I'm using the facts from the 1996 case, which is Wren, which is the key case here. But it could also be used to justify, well, they don't know. You're a person of color, and they suspect you may be up to no good, and they want to stop you for that reason. That is impermissible. That is not allowed. But they can stop you for the U-turn, and then see what happens out of that stop. And so this has led to widespread racial profiling. Right? It has essentially allowed the police to engage in racial profiling, because the only constitutional check on racial profiling is no longer the Fourth Amendment. Right? These are Fourth Amendment cases. It's the Equal Protection Clause. There you have to prove that the police are intentionally treating you differently because of your race. And it is very, very difficult to prove what's going on inside someone's head. You usually don't have that kind of smoking gun evidence that we talked about earlier. So we have the failure of constitutional regulation to stop racial profiling. But rules can be changed in this regard. States can implement different rules. So there's at least one state where you cannot conduct pretextual stops. It's just not allowed. Now, in our consent decrees, we often put in a provision that said, okay, if you want to conduct a pretext stop, you can do it, but only if you have this level of suspicion of an actual crime that you're interested in engaging in, and you get supervisor approval. And getting supervisory approval is like hitting the brakes, because that takes time, and someone has to think about it, call back, and so forth. So I think that's how you modify police behavior, not just sort of telling people something during the course of an 8-hour training.
Can I ask a question? How do we get those kinds of systemic, structural changes? You said, I think accurately, that the Justice Department is no longer pursuing, at least for a couple of years, right, these kind of cases. And you see, and maybe I'm wrong, but when these incidents happen frequently, totally understandably, communities want justice. Right, they want individual officers held accountable. It's a much longer, harder story, right, to get, changes in incentives of how police are evaluated based on traffic stops. So how do you get in this environment, without the prod from the Justice Department, how can those who want to get change systemically in communities work towards and see that happen?
Okay, I'll try to be brief. I know there's some other hands. So, yes, the Department of Justice is more or less closed for business right now. That's not totally fair to my friends who still work there. They are trying to do the best they can, but the Attorney General has signaled in no uncertain terms that he's not interested in systemic police reform. And it seems to me that he doesn't believe that systemic police misconduct exists. He's pushing very hard the narrative of there's a few bad apples and I'm going to prosecute those bad apples, but everything else is fine. But that's not true for everyone. There are other options. California has a statute that is very much like the federal statute that allows the Attorney General of California to investigate police departments. It's been used twice in California. And 2 new investigations were announced by Kamala Harris in December of 2016 before she joined the Senate. And that could be used more. So I don't know, students here who are going back to California, if there are any in the room, you could ask the state authorities to use that more. New York has a similar statute. Illinois doesn't have that statute, but used a creative legal theory to sue, and is now trying to resolve the case with Chicago Police Department to reform their police department using the findings that we did. In January 2017, we issued a findings letter finding a pattern of excessive force and widespread accountability failings in the Chicago Police Department. We would have pursued a consent decree, but we are no longer running the show. So the Justice Department let it drop. And the Illinois Attorney General's office picked it up. So there's the possibility of state level power here. So a few states have it, more could. So we could have the Democratic movement, get some bills passed, empower state officials in that regard. Another thing is just people power in changing the law in some other direct ways. Washington State had the absolute worst statute for prosecuting police officers. It had the highest level of intent required in order to find that an officer used excessive force. You had to find that an officer acted with malice, which is like worse than a first degree, you know, it's essentially a first degree murder standard. And so no officer had ever been charged in, well, one officer actually had been charged in Washington, all of Washington State. There was a massive movement of petition gathering, petition signing, and there was going to be a movement that they did accomplish putting that on the ballot for this fall, and it was going to be a ballot initiative to change that law. And it ended up getting short-circuited because they went to legislators who said, hey, can you just change this now, because this is going to be a knockdown, drag-out. We're going to win, but it's going to be ugly for everyone. And they ended up changing that law, which is a big win. And so I believe that criminal justice is experienced by and large at the state and local level, and that means there's a lot of progress that can be made in this moment, even though the federal government is, in my view, on the wrong side of criminal justice reform issues right now.
So it seems to me that a lot of the acquittals that we keep seeing are product of the reasonable police officer, reasonable force standard. California is thinking about changing the language, passing a bill that says that police officers should only use force when necessary. Do you think that would actually make a difference, or since, in my opinion, a lot of times police officers aren't acting what I would call reasonable, our deference to police will still win over?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I like the impulse, but I will say it is very hard to disaggregate these acquittals. There are so many factors that go into it. I think the Supreme Court standard of, just for folks who may not have the background, the Fourth Amendment requires reasonable conduct. The officer has to be acting reasonably. There's a lot of language in the relevant Supreme Court cases that is very deferential to police officers, highlighting the fact that they are operating in tense, fast-moving situations where they have to act quickly. And so that is actually not the law of criminal liability when it comes to police force. It is the floor for what the Constitution requires of police, reasonable conduct. States could set higher levels, which is what the question is referring to. In fact, states have integrated the Supreme Court law into their own statutes and into their jury instructions, so it reappears. And it's a defense virtually all the time. The officer could say act reasonably and uses the language from the Supreme Court cases, which ends up in the jury instructions. I think changing the language to require necessary would actually be closer to what the Fourth Amendment was intended to require. One of the early cases did use the word necessary, and it's dropped out over time, and now we just don't see it much anymore. So I think that could be helpful, but there are so many other things, like juries being deferential to police officers, as you referenced. The standards are obviously very high in criminal cases. The defense strategies often involve dirtying up the victim, so the person's been shot. We saw this very clearly in the Philando Castile case, where there was a lot of talk about his marijuana use and what that had to do with the fact that he was shot by an officer who was clearly freaked out when he was going for his wallet after the officer asked him for the wallet, after having politely told the officer that he had a gun. It's hard to fathom. But there's a theory, right? The theory of the defense was, no, he was reaching for his gun. He might have been doing it mistakenly, and that was because he was high. But from the officer's perspective, he was going for his gun. So these things find their way into cases, and it's very hard to pull them apart. But I do think it's a factor that the standard is so deferential, and that the Supreme Court's cases have been really out of sync with community standards for what is reasonable conduct. So I think it's worth changing.
We have brief closing comments from our presenters. I keep talking.
I've said what
could say one other thing. Just 'cause I'm clearly enjoying the conversations, a lot of interesting questions. I just want to make clear how important it was over the last few years at the Justice Department in the Obama administration that people, average people, everyday people, young people, were out in the street over this issue of police misconduct. That was not insignificant. I just want you to know from being within the building, that was very important and significant in getting support for the police reform program. And you end up having, we had an Attorney General, Eric Holder, who was committed to reform, the second Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, who was also committed to the program. But I don't think we would have had the power and the influence and the ability to staff up a little bit more to do these cases had it not been for the reaction to Ferguson and folks continuing to organize on the ground throughout the communities. And so I think it can feel often like government is not responsive to what is going on out in the community. And it's like, what is the point in protesting? I remember I felt that way during the run-up to the Iraq War. There were massive protests that seemed to make no difference. I just want folks to know that it did make a difference here to have smart, sophisticated analyses alongside people making those analyses in the street as well. That really did make a difference. So thanks to any and all who were involved.
I just want to second that, and I actually am very, I'm really struck by the fact that hashtag, or the March for Our Lives, really makes me think that, that they've reached out and they're trying to coordinate it with Black Lives Matter. And that we are in a different era than we were under the Obama administration. And I think that kind of reaching out is extremely important when our Justice Department has hinted that they want to consider Black Lives Matter a terrorist organization, when not only these standards, but the actual, just that everything has been inverted, and it's literally the meaning of words has been turned upside down. But the pushback against these young people actually reminds me of the pushback against the Freedom Riders. This attack on their humanity, the threats against them from making fun of whether they got into college or not, but also really saying that they're dancing on the graves of other people. Really, I think we have to go back to the Children's March in Birmingham in 1963, when Bull Connor took hoses to children. People keep forgetting that was against children, and that hose was strong enough to tear their flesh, tear their clothes off, remove bricks from the sides of buildings. And it seems to me that that kind of response is more like what we're going to see to these kinds of public pressure against government. And I think it's really important to bear in mind that there is, again, a kind of extraordinary emotional hostility that I think we're all going to have the courage to confront, and not just sort of kowtow that belligerence is somehow the same as good governance.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you all.